Okay, well, I want to get back to strategy. That's what we were talking about before this last break. So Jeannie, we were talking about the effectiveness of that strategy, whether President Trump tying Kamala Harris to the current president, Joe Biden. Was that effective? Do you think it got lost?
I think something to keep in mind is the way Americans tend to watch events like this. Most people aren't sitting down on their couch, rapt attention on the screen. They're typically doing other things, kind of multitasking. And one of the patterns that I noticed across the debate was that Kamala tended to focus really heavily on Trump over and over and over again. And the effect of that subconsciously for the viewer can be to gain the impression that Trump is the most important person in the room, because all of the attention is on him, even though it might be negative attention, because all of the attention is on him, he must be the most powerful force in the room. And what he did in turn, like Jay was pointing out, was yes, be very, several times attempted to attach her to Biden's agenda, but more often than not, just dismissed them both as weak. And I think that particular dynamic may subconsciously play against her with swing voters.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point about the focus on President Trump. It seemed like a half hour in, something switched in the moderator's questions where there was a lot of focus on Trump's record, things he has said on Truth Social, things he said at his rallies, which I'm not sure that the Harris campaign wanted that to be a focus at any point. Because it seemed, as you said, to then focus a lot on him and not her. So I wonder, why do you think that ended up being a big focus, and did that hurt Harris at all?
I mean, why it's a big focus? I mean, it's hard to deviate from him, right? It's just sort of this phenomenon that we have, because we said it earlier in our conversation, is that there is the sort of sideshow to him, this unpredictability and what's going to happen with him. And I noticed, and we talked about, that it seemed as though there were more moments where his mic was not muted, but hers was. And so, that captured our attention to an extent as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure what ended up being the strategy on the mic muting and not muting.
What the rule was.
Because it seemed like as long as you said, excuse me, I need to say something, then you were able to say something, which is why the debate definitely went over 90 minutes, it seems. Yeah. But let's still keep diving in on the strategy part, because we have some stuff from the candidates going to play. It seemed as though while there was a lot of focus on President Trump, there were moments when Vice President Kamala Harris kept using the phrase turn the page, whether it was about President Biden or President Trump. She tried to distinguish herself as that turn the page candidate. Here's what they had to say.
But they're destroying our economy. They have no idea what a good economy is. Their oil policies, every single policy. And remember this, she is Biden. She's trying to get away from Biden. I don't know the gentleman, she says. She is Biden. The worst inflation we've ever had, a horrible economy because inflation has made it so bad, and she can't get away with that.
Clearly, I am not Joe Biden, and I am certainly not Donald Trump. And what I do offer is a new generation of leadership for our country, one who believes in what is possible, one who brings a sense of optimism about what we can do instead of always disparaging the American people.
So on that point, a lot of the campaign talk before even Kamala Harris got into the race was about age and about the generations and things like that. It seemed like this was a moment for her to make that argument as a candidate of change. That was probably the biggest moment of that tonight. Were there any moments that stood out to you that maybe she made that argument as well? And was that an effective argument, do you think?
I saw her steering clear of that, and I think that was a wise decision.
Really?
As the commentators sort of invited them to talk about race as well, those kinds of very personal attributes, personal characteristics, if she had gone after him in that category, it would have undermined her own party for having run someone equally aged.
Sure.
So I don't think that was a winning strategy for her.
Well, I think more so about, there's a lot of polls that say that there's a lot of double negatives, people who didn't like Biden and didn't like Trump. So speaking to those voters who might be available, I'm not either of them. I'm a new generation. That's more than I meant. Not that I'm just the younger candidate.
Yeah.
I think she spoke a lot to the future. I think her closing statement did it, but she did it throughout. In lots of ways. She talked about turning the page. She talked about the future. She talked about, young people. She talked about things that are important, growing an economy, climate change, an existential threat that so many young people are really concerned about. So I think she did in some explicit and implicit ways.
And I also think the getting under his skin strategy seemed to be apparent. It seemed like she didn't want to focus a lot of time on just this is what he is, but just enough to get him to take the bait. And it seemed like the first indication of that was talking about his rallies.
But she did it in such a unique way. I invite you all. She talked to the American people. I invite you all to go to his rally and see for yourself.
And Jay, you saw that as a turning point.
Oh, yeah. It was like a switch got flipped during the debate because Trump's demeanor changed dramatically from that point on. He was very calm and composed in the first half hour. But the moment she brought up his rallies and talked about people leaving, he became very aggressive and agitated, and it was just a different debate from that point on.
And when he gets kind of in that defensive mode that we saw, does that do him any favors?
No.
I don't think so.
No. They really switched places temperament-wise because at the very beginning of the debate, you could hear her voice catching a little bit. She seemed a little more nervous, a lot of adrenaline in your system. And he seemed calmer and was sort of sticking with his main platforms. And just like Jay said, masterful placement by her campaign, that little very subtle invitation / barb, right? We need a new catchphrase for that kind of move by her. But from then he was off balance.